I need to tell someone what I did, and you're going to think I'm terrible. But there's something about watching a grown man cry that nobody understands until they've lived through what I lived through. Everyone's saying I'm heartless, that I destroyed a good man over nothing. But the truth is so much more complicated than a single sentence I said at dinner. The worst part isn't even that Marcus walked out. It's what happened before that moment, and what I found out after, and why I can't bring myself to apologize even though everyone's telling me I should. If I don't tell this story properly, you'll never understand why I said what I said. You'll just see a woman who kicked a man when he was down, who mocked him for showing emotion, who deserved to be ghosted. But once you know what I know, once you understand the pattern I'd been seeing for months, you'll see why those 4 words came out of my mouth even though part of me knew they were cruel. I'm going to tell you everything, including the thing I did right before he walked out that made it so much worse. The part that makes me look worst? I'm saving that for later because you need to understand who Marcus was to me first. You need to understand what those tears meant in the context of everything else. Marcus and I met at a nonprofit fundraiser 18 months ago. I was there representing the marketing firm where I work. He was there because he just launched some app that connected volunteers with local causes. He had this way of talking about helping people that felt genuine, not performative like most tech guys. When he teared up during a speech about a kid his app had helped get into a mentorship program, I thought it showed he had a real heart. I actually told my best friend Shayna that night that I'd finally met a man who wasn't afraid to feel things. God, the irony of that. The first 6 months were honestly perfect. Marcus was attentive, thoughtful, always asking about my day, always wanting to know how I was feeling. He'd send me articles he thought I'd like, remember tiny details about my childhood stories, show up with my favorite coffee order on stressful mornings. When my mom had a health scare, he was there holding my hand in the hospital waiting room, telling me it was okay to be scared. But he also cried when his favorite coffee shop changed their brand of oat milk. He cried during a commercial about a dog finding a home. He cried when his fantasy football team lost. He cried when we watched the news. He cried when I told him I needed to reschedule a date because of a work deadline. At first, I found it endearing, sensitive, emotionally available. All the things women are supposed to want, right? All the things I'd complain my ex-boyfriends lacked. But here's what nobody tells you about dating someone who cries all the time. It stops being about their emotions and starts being about managing their emotions. Every interaction becomes a potential minefield. Every conversation requires you to gauge whether this might be a crying situation. I started noticing it around month 7. We were at his place watching a movie, and I mentioned that I didn't love the pasta he'd made. Not in a mean way, just honest feedback when he asked what I thought. His eyes immediately filled with tears. He said he'd really tried to make it special, that he'd spent all afternoon on the sauce, that he just wanted to do something nice for me. Suddenly I was the one apologizing, reassuring him, telling him the pasta was actually fine and I was just being picky. The thing was, the pasta genuinely wasn't good. It was oversalted and the noodles were mushy. But pointing that out, even gently, even when directly asked, had become an act of cruelty that made me the bad guy. It happened again 2 weeks later when I beat him at mini golf. Actual tears because he wanted to impress me and felt like he couldn't do anything right. I spent 20 minutes in the parking lot telling him he was great at tons of things, that mini golf didn't matter, that I didn't think less of him. Meanwhile, I was thinking about how my friend's boyfriend had trash-talked her all through their last game and how she'd laughed about his competitiveness. Normal relationship stuff, not whatever this was becoming. I started talking to Shayna about it, testing the waters to see if I was being unreasonable. He's just sensitive, she said. Isn't that what you wanted? And she was right, it was what I'd said I wanted. I'd spent years complaining about emotionally unavailable men, stoic men, men who couldn't communicate their feelings. Now I had someone who communicated feelings constantly and I was complaining about that too. So I kept my mouth shut about it. I told myself I was being unfair, that I was judging Marcus by outdated standards, that his emotional openness was a feature, not a bug. I read articles about toxic masculinity and how we condition men not to show vulnerability. I felt guilty for my annoyance. I tried to reframe his tears as a sign of his depth of feeling. But then it started affecting my life in ways I couldn't ignore. I got a promotion at work, a big one I'd been working toward for 3 years. Account director, corner office, 20% raise. I was ecstatic. I called Marcus from the parking lot, and he immediately started crying. Happy tears, he said. He was so proud of me. Which would have been sweet except that when I got to his place that evening, expecting to celebrate, he was still crying. Now it was because he felt bad about himself, about his app not doing as well as he'd hoped, about how I was moving up in the world and he was stagnating. My promotion celebration turned into me comforting him about his career insecurities for 2 hours. We never did go out to dinner like I'd planned. I ended up ordering pizza and watching him spiral about whether he'd peaked, whether his business would ever take off, whether he was going to disappoint everyone who believed in him. I didn't tell anyone about that, not even Shayna, because I knew how it would sound. My boyfriend was too emotional about my success, felt like the kind of thing that made me sound like a monster. Just when I thought I'd adjusted to this dynamic, things got worse. Marcus started crying preemptively. He'd tear up before telling me something, before asking me something, as if his emotions needed to lead every interaction. I know you're going to be upset, but... Followed by tears, followed by something completely mundane like he'd accidentally shrunk my sweater in the wash or he'd forgot to pick up the dry cleaning. The tears had become a shield. They made it impossible for me to react naturally to anything, because any response other than immediate comfort and reassurance made me the villain. I couldn't be annoyed about the shrunk sweater because he was already crying about it. My annoyance would just be me kicking him while he was down. I started feeling like I was in a relationship with a child. Not because men who cry are childish, but because the dynamic had become parent and child. His emotions were always the priority. My role was to soothe, to reassure, to manage his feelings so he could function. My own emotions got smaller and smaller, packed away, because there simply wasn't room for both of us to have feelings. When I was stressed about work, I couldn't tell him because he'd cry about not being a supportive enough partner. When I was upset about something my sister said, I couldn't vent because he'd cry about my family not liking him even when it had nothing to do with him. When I wanted to have a serious conversation about our future, he'd cry before we even started, and the conversation would derail into reassurance. I felt trapped in a cage of his emotions, and the worst part was that I couldn't even complain about it without sounding like exactly the kind of toxic person who perpetuates harmful stereotypes about masculinity. Around month 14, I started fantasizing about my ex. Not because he was better than Marcus, but because I could just exist around him. I could have a bad day without managing someone else's reaction to my bad day. I could give honest feedback. I could be annoyed about small things without it becoming a referendum on the entire relationship. I knew this was a problem. I knew that if I was romanticizing a relationship that had ended because of my ex's emotional unavailability, something was deeply wrong with my current relationship. But I still didn't know how to address it. How do you tell someone they're too emotional? How do you have that conversation without becoming the villain of your own story? I tried once, sort of. I said something like, I feel like we spend a lot of time processing your emotions and I'd like more space for mine. He cried. Of course he cried. He said he didn't realize he was so draining, that he felt terrible about taking up so much space, that he'd try to be less of a burden. Then he cried more because he felt like he was failing at being a good partner. I gave up after that. The conversation about him crying too much had just resulted in more crying. That's when I started pulling away. Nothing dramatic, just little things. I took longer to text back. I made more plans with friends. I stayed late at work even when I didn't need to. I suggested fewer date nights. When he asked if everything was okay, I said I was just stressed about work, which was partially true. The full truth was that I needed space from the emotional intensity that had taken over my life. Marcus noticed, obviously, and he handled it exactly how you'd expect. More tears, more processing, more long conversations where he asked what he was doing wrong, and I scrambled to reassure him that nothing was wrong while simultaneously knowing that everything was wrong. I started to resent him. Real, bitter resentment that sat in my chest like a stone. I resented that I couldn't be honest. I resented that his feelings always mattered more than mine. I resented that I'd become a supporting character in the ongoing drama of his emotional life. I resented that something I'd initially loved about him had become the thing I couldn't stand. But I still didn't break up with him, because what would I even say? You're too sensitive. You cry too much. Your emotional availability has become exhausting. Every possible version of that conversation made me sound terrible. Which brings me to 3 weeks ago, the dinner. The moment everyone knows about because Marcus told everyone what I said. We'd been together for about 18 months at that point. He'd made a reservation at this upscale Italian place downtown, somewhere we'd been talking about trying. I knew something was up because he'd been weird all week, anxious and emotional and dropping hints about big conversations and our future. I had a terrible feeling I knew what was coming, and I wasn't ready. Not because I wanted to marry him, but because I didn't, and I still hadn't figured out how to end things without becoming the woman who destroyed a sensitive man's heart. We ordered drinks, made small talk, and then right after the appetizers arrived, Marcus started crying. Right there in the restaurant. He took my hand across the table, tears already streaming down his face, and started talking about how much he loved me, how I'd changed his life, how he'd never felt this way about anyone. I felt my whole body tense. This was it. He was going to propose. In this restaurant while crying while I was planning my exit strategy from the relationship. People at nearby tables were already glancing over, probably thinking they were about to witness a magical engagement moment. But then he didn't propose. Instead, he told me his app was failing. Really failing. He was going to have to shut it down. He'd run out of funding, couldn't get investors, and he'd already burned through most of his savings trying to keep it alive. He was probably going to have to move back in with his parents. He was crying harder now, full sobs, not even trying to hide it. I felt a wave of relief that he wasn't proposing, followed immediately by sympathy for what he was going through, followed by a familiar exhaustion at being the emotional support system once again. I'm sorry, I said, because I was, genuinely. That's really hard. What can I do to help? He squeezed my hand tighter. Just be here for me. I don't know what I'd do without you. You're the only good thing in my life right now. Promise you won't leave me. And there it was, the thing I'd been dreading. The attachment, the dependence, the emotional weight of being someone's only source of stability. I could feel the cage getting smaller. Of course, I said, because what else could I say in a crowded restaurant while he sobbed openly? He started talking about his feelings, about his fear of failure, about disappointing his parents, about wondering if he'd made a huge mistake leaving his corporate job 3 years ago to pursue this dream. All valid feelings, all understandable. But we were in public at a nice restaurant, and he was fully crying, not eating, attracting stares from every direction. The server came by and awkwardly asked if everything was okay with the food. Marcus didn't even notice. I said everything was fine and asked for more time, feeling my face burn with embarrassment. Here's the thing nobody talks about: watching someone cry constantly doesn't make you more compassionate. It makes you numb. Each time carries less weight. It stops being a meaningful expression of deep emotion and starts being just another thing they do, like clearing their throat or checking their phone. So while Marcus poured his heart out about his failed business and uncertain future, I felt nothing. Just that familiar exhaustion and a desperate wish to be anywhere else. I looked at the food getting cold, at the expensive wine we'd ordered, at the other couples having normal dinners, and I felt so unbelievably tired. Then Marcus said something that flipped a switch in me. I've been crying every day for weeks about this. I can't eat, I can't sleep, I just cry all the time. I know I need to be stronger, but I just can't stop. And I thought, you cry all the time anyway. You cry about everything. How would anyone even know the difference? The thought shocked me with its cruelty, but I couldn't unfeel it. It was true. He cried about small things and big things with equal intensity. His business failing was objectively terrible, but he'd cried just as hard about his favorite show being canceled last month. The tears had lost all meaning through overuse. What are you thinking? He asked, searching my face. I should have lied. I should have said something supportive and gotten through the dinner and maybe broken up with him kindly the next week. But I was so tired. Tired of managing his emotions, tired of being his emotional support human, tired of every single moment requiring me to prioritize his feelings. I'm thinking, I said slowly, that maybe this is an opportunity to figure out a more sustainable way to handle difficult emotions. His face crumpled further. What does that mean? It means crying every day for weeks isn't healthy, Marcus. Maybe you should talk to someone professional about coping strategies. You think I need therapy because I'm upset about my business failing? His voice rose slightly, drew more looks. I think you might benefit from having more tools to process emotions, yes. He pulled his hand back from mine. I can't believe you're making this about my feelings being wrong. My whole life is falling apart and you're telling me I'm handling it wrong? That's not what I said. It's exactly what you said. He was crying harder now. I open up to you, I'm vulnerable with you, and you treat me like I'm defective. People were definitely watching now. The couple next to us had stopped even pretending to talk to each other. Marcus, can we talk about this somewhere more private? Why? Because you're embarrassed to be seen with me when I'm emotional. Because real men don't cry in public, is that it? He said it sarcastically, throwing it at me like an accusation, and something in me just snapped. All the months of swallowed frustration, of suppressed honesty, of making myself smaller to accommodate the ever-expanding space his emotions took up, just crystallized into 4 words. I looked him dead in the eye and said, real men don't cry this much. The table went silent. Marcus stared at me like I'd slapped him. I stared back, and even though I knew I should take it back immediately, should apologize, should do damage control, I didn't. Because beneath the shock of hearing myself say it, there was relief. I'd finally said the thing I'd been thinking for months. Wow, he said quietly. The tears had actually stopped, replaced by something harder in his expression. Real men don't cry, got it. Good to know what you really think. Marcus, I didn't mean, but I had meant it. Maybe not exactly those words, maybe not the implication that masculinity and stoicism were linked, but I'd meant that his constant crying was too much. That it wasn't normal, that it was affecting our relationship in ways I couldn't sustain. He stood up, tossed his napkin on the table. I thought you were different. I thought you were someone I could be real with. Turns out you're just like everyone else who told me to man up and stop being so sensitive. That's not fair. This isn't about one conversation, Marcus. This is about a pattern of me being human, of me having feelings. Yeah, what a terrible pattern. He was already walking away from the table. I sat there, frozen, watching him navigate through the restaurant. Part of me wanted to chase after him to fix it, to explain what I'd really meant. But a larger part of me felt relieved that he was leaving, that I didn't have to manage this anymore. The server returned, confused about whether to clear his plate. I asked for the check, paid for food we'd barely touched, and left. I expected Marcus to call that night, or at least text. That's what always happened after our fights. He'd process his feelings, usually while crying, and we'd talk it through, and I'd end up apologizing for whatever I'd done to upset him. But he didn't call. He didn't text. He didn't respond to my messages asking if we could talk. By day 3 I started to panic a little, not because I desperately wanted him back, but because the uncertainty was worse than a clean ending. I called. It went straight to voicemail. I called again from a work phone. It rang through, but he didn't answer. He'd blocked me. Shayna heard what happened, obviously. Marcus had told his friends, who told mutual acquaintances, and within a week everyone knew that I'd told a crying man that real men don't cry at a public restaurant. The story made me sound like a monster, and technically it was accurate. What were you thinking? Shayna asked when she finally called me. I know Marcus could be a lot, but Jesus, that's such a cruel thing to say. I tried to explain the context, the months of build-up, the emotional exhaustion, but even to my best friend it sounded like excuses. It sounded like I was blaming him for having feelings. He was telling you his business failed and you mocked him for crying about it, she said. How did you think that was okay? It wasn't just about that moment, I insisted. It was about everything. He cried constantly, Shayna, about everything. I couldn't breathe in that relationship. So you should have broken up with him, not attacked him for showing emotion. She was right, of course, but she wasn't hearing what I was trying to say. Nobody was. The narrative had solidified. I was the woman who told a vulnerable man in crisis that real men don't cry. Anything I said to add context just sounded like deflection. Work got awkward. One of my colleagues knew Marcus through the nonprofit circuit and made a pointed comment about emotional intelligence. A woman I barely knew cornered me in the bathroom to say she'd heard what happened, and that women like me were the reason men committed suicide at higher rates. That one actually got to me. Not because I thought she was right, but because I started wondering if maybe everyone else was seeing something I wasn't. Was I the problem? Had I become so damaged by my ex's emotional unavailability that I'd overcorrected and couldn't handle normal emotional expression? I went down a rabbit hole of articles about men's mental health, about the damage caused by telling boys not to cry, about toxic masculinity and emotional repression. Everything I read made me feel worse. I'd said the exact thing that those articles warned against. I'd reinforced the exact harmful stereotype that causes so much damage. But then I'd find myself remembering specific moments. Marcus crying because I wanted to watch a different movie than him. Marcus crying because a barista got his order wrong. Marcus crying because I went to dinner with coworkers without inviting him. And I'd think that's not the same as normal emotional expression. That's something else. I tried to find articles about emotional manipulation, about weaponized vulnerability, but everything I found was about men weaponizing women's emotions, not the other way around. There was no vocabulary for what I'd experienced, no framework that made me anything other than the villain. 2 weeks after the dinner, Marcus finally responded to my messages. Just one text: I need time. Please respect that and stop contacting me. I almost laughed at the irony. He needed time. He needed space. All the things I'd needed for months but couldn't ask for without managing his emotional reaction to my need for space. But I also felt a genuine stab of guilt. Whatever the context, whatever had led to that moment, I'd said something cruel to someone I'd cared about. The specific words I'd chosen were indefensible. Real men don't cry wasn't a boundary, it was an attack. It was me using the most hurtful language I could find to wound him the way his constant emotions had wounded me. I typed out an apology text about 15 times. Each version felt either too defensive or not honest enough. How could I apologize for what I'd said without lying about what I'd meant? I was sorry for the words, but I wasn't sorry for wanting the crying to stop. I wasn't sorry for being exhausted. I wasn't sorry for reaching a breaking point. In the end, I didn't send anything. He wanted space, so I gave him space. Shayna stopped talking to me as much. Not dramatically, just a slow fade, fewer texts, fewer invitations to hang out. When I asked her directly if she was mad at me, she said no, she just thought I needed to do some work on myself before she could be around me. That hurt more than I expected. My mom, when I finally told her Marcus and I had broken up, asked what happened. I gave her a vague answer about incompatibility. She pressed for details. I told her we fought at dinner and said some things we couldn't take back. What could you possibly have said that was so bad? She asked. I told her. She was quiet for a long moment. Oh honey, she finally said. Why would you say that? Because he cried all the time, Mom, not just about big things, about everything, constantly. I couldn't take it anymore. So you attacked his masculinity, you of all people, with your opinions about toxic masculinity and emotional availability. I know how it sounds. It sounds like you were cruel to someone who trusted you with his vulnerability. Everyone had the same reaction. Everyone saw me as the villain. And the worst part was that I couldn't even fully disagree with them. I had been cruel. The words I'd chosen were designed to hurt him in a specific, gendered way that I knew would land. But I also couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was missing the point. That the focus on those 4 words was overshadowing the legitimate issue underneath. That if Marcus had been a woman crying constantly about everything, people would recognize it as an unhealthy coping mechanism. But because he was a man defying gender stereotypes by being emotional, his behavior got a pass. 3 weeks after the dinner, I ran into one of Marcus's friends at a coffee shop. Eric. We'd hung out in group settings a few times. He saw me and I could see him debating whether to acknowledge me or pretend he hadn't noticed. He chose acknowledgement. Hey, he said, not warm but not hostile. Hey, how are you? Good, how are you? The pleasantries felt absurd given the context. We both knew why this was awkward. I know you probably hate me, I said. Marcus probably told you everything. Eric shrugged. He told me his version. I'm sure yours is different. Not that different. I said something terrible. Yeah, you did, he paused, but for what it's worth, I don't think you're entirely wrong. I looked up sharply. What? He glanced around like he was checking if anyone could hear us. Marcus is my friend, I care about him, but yeah, the crying thing is a lot. It's always been a lot. Has it? Dude, we can't play video games without him crying if he loses, or if he wins and feels bad that someone else lost, or if a cutscene is slightly emotional, it's exhausting. I felt a complicated rush of validation and guilt. I shouldn't have said what I said. Probably not, but I get it. And honestly, maybe someone needed to say something, even if you said it in the worst possible way. He shifted his weight. He's been telling everyone you're this monster who attacked him for being vulnerable. But he's also been crying about it nonstop for weeks, and I'm like, at some point you have to process this and move forward, you know. This conversation felt dangerous, like if anyone heard us talking about Marcus this way, we'd both be vilified. But it also felt like the first honest conversation I'd had about this in weeks. Is he okay? I asked. Define okay. He's staying with his parents. The app thing is done. He's looking for jobs but also spiraling pretty hard about the failure. Lots of feelings about it all. I feel terrible about the timing. I didn't know he was going to tell me about the app failing that night. Would it have changed what you said? I thought about it honestly. Probably not. Maybe I would have held it in for one more dinner, but it was coming. I'd been wanting out for months. Then you did him a favor, better than leading him on. I don't think anyone else sees it that way. Eric smiled grimly. Yeah, well, you committed the cardinal sin. You told a man he cries too much. In this social climate, that's basically unforgivable. We talked for a few more minutes before parting ways. The conversation didn't absolve me of anything, but it did make me feel slightly less alone in my perspective. That night, I did something I'm not proud of. I checked Marcus's social media. He'd unblocked me, or maybe just hadn't blocked me there in the first place. His posts were all about self-care and healing and learning who your real friends are. Vague enough to be about anything, but clearly about me if you knew the context. The comments were full of support. Lots of you deserve better, and her loss and heart emojis. He posted a photo from the nonprofit fundraiser where we'd met, Throwback Thursday or something. The caption was about staying true to yourself and not letting others make you feel wrong for feeling deeply. The comments on that one were more pointed. Several people who knew me offering support to him, implicitly condemning me. I felt sick reading it, not because anything he'd posted was a lie, but because it was such a careful curation of the narrative. He was the sensitive soul wounded by a cruel woman. I was the woman who mocked vulnerability. The full context, the months of drowning in his emotions, the loss of my own space to feel things, none of that was part of the story. But how could it be? If I tried to tell my side, I'd just be the villain making excuses. He cried too much wasn't a defense anyone would accept. His emotional needs overwhelmed me sounded like code for I wanted him to man up. I started writing a post of my own trying to explain, but every version sounded defensive and bitter. I deleted them all. Just when I thought the whole thing was going to fade into awkward history, something else happened that changed everything. Marcus's ex reached out to me. Sarah, I knew of her vaguely, knew they'd dated for about a year before me, but we'd never interacted directly. She sent me a DM on Instagram. I heard what happened. I'm sorry you're going through this. Can we talk? I stared at the message for a long time before responding. Sure, what's up? Not over text, coffee? We met at a place across town where we were unlikely to run into anyone we knew. Sarah was pretty, put together, friendly. We made awkward small talk for a few minutes before she got to the point. I dated Marcus for 14 months, she said, and I need you to know that what you're experiencing right now, the backlash and the narrative, it's exactly what happened to me. What do you mean? I mean I also became the villain when I ended things with him. Different details but same basic story. He told everyone I was cold and couldn't handle a man with feelings. I leaned forward. Was he the same way with you? The crying, constantly, about everything. It was like being in a relationship with someone who had no emotional regulation at all. She paused. I actually suggested therapy multiple times, gently or so I thought. He'd cry and say I was treating him like he was broken. That's exactly what he said to me. Right, because suggesting professional support for someone who cries daily is somehow an attack on their masculinity. Even though if he was handling his emotions in any other unhealthy way, suggesting therapy would be completely reasonable. We talked for over an hour. The parallels were eerie. The way Marcus's emotions took up all the space in the relationship. The inability to have honest conversations without managing his feelings about the conversation. The exhaustion of being someone's sole emotional support system. The eventual breakdown and villainization. How did you end it? I asked. I finally just did it. Told him I didn't think we were compatible. He cried for hours, literally hours. I had to leave my own apartment because he wouldn't stop processing his feelings about the breakup in front of me. Then he told everyone I blindsided him and couldn't handle a sensitive man. Did anyone believe your side? Not really. A few people stayed neutral, but mostly I lost that whole social circle. It was easier than fighting the narrative. Do you think there's something actually wrong with him? Like clinically, Sarah considered this. I don't know, maybe. Or maybe he just learned early on that crying gets him attention and care, and he never developed other coping mechanisms. Either way, it's not sustainable for a partner. But everyone acts like I'm a monster for not being able to handle it. Because the cultural conversation right now is so focused on men being allowed to have feelings that there's no room for nuance. There's no room to say that someone can be emotionally expressive in unhealthy ways. It all gets flattened into either you support men's emotions or you're perpetuating toxic masculinity. I felt tears prickling my own eyes, the relief of being understood. I really did try. For months, I wanted to be supportive. I know I tried too, but you can't light yourself on fire to keep someone else warm, even if everyone watching thinks you should. We exchanged numbers, promised to stay in touch. As we were leaving, Sarah said something that stuck with me. The thing that bothers me most is that Marcus probably does need real help. But as long as everyone around him validates that his emotional reactions are totally normal and anyone who can't handle them is the problem, he's never going to get it. We didn't do him any favors by becoming the villains of his story. I drove home thinking about that. About how the narrative of Marcus as a sensitive soul wounded by cruel women might actually be preventing him from getting help he genuinely needed. About how my own guilt and everyone else's condemnation might be easier for him than actual self-examination. But I also thought about those 4 words I'd said. About how even if I had legitimate grievances, even if the relationship was unsustainable, I'd chosen to express it in the most hurtful way possible. I'd weaponized gender stereotypes I claim not to believe in. I'd gone for the jugular. That night I drafted an actual apology to Marcus. Not to get back together, not to change the narrative, just to take responsibility for my part in how things ended. Marcus, I know you asked for space and I've tried to respect that. I'm not reaching out to defend myself or to change your mind about anything. I just want to say that I'm genuinely sorry for what I said at dinner. Those specific words were cruel and I knew they would hurt you. You didn't deserve that, regardless of what was happening in our relationship. I should have handled the situation with more maturity and compassion. I hope you're doing okay. I read it over a dozen times, then sent it before I could overthink it further. He didn't respond. I didn't expect him to. A week later, I saw through a mutual friend's story that Marcus had started a new job. Corporate position, good company, stable. I felt genuinely happy for him. Whatever else was true, I did care about him. I had wanted him to be okay. But I also felt the finality of it. That chapter was closed. The villain of his story was me, and there was nothing I could do to change that. The people who believed I was terrible would keep believing it. The few people who understood the fuller context, like Eric and Sarah, would keep that understanding quiet because it wasn't socially acceptable to voice. I've been thinking a lot about what I learned from all of this. About the difference between emotional availability and emotional dependency. About how the same trait that attracts you to someone can become the thing that suffocates you. About how sometimes 2 people can both be hurt and both be wrong and both be right all at the same time. I've also been thinking about those 4 words. About how in one moment of frustration, I reinforced every harmful stereotype about masculinity and emotion that I claimed to reject. About how my breaking point happened to align with one of the worst possible things I could have said. If I could go back, would I do it differently? I'd like to say yes, that I'd break up with him kindly months earlier, that I'd never let it get to that point. But I honestly don't know. Because the truth is that trying to break up with Marcus kindly would have involved managing his emotional reaction to the breakup, which is exactly what I was trying to escape. There might not have been a kind way out that didn't involve months of processing his feelings about my feelings. Shayna eventually started talking to me again, though things aren't quite the same. She said she understood my side better after some distance, but that she still thought I'd handled it badly. I agreed because I had. My mom asked me recently if I'd learned anything from the experience. I told her I learned that relationships require both people to have some level of emotional regulation, that supporting someone's feelings is different from managing them, and that there's no good way to say someone's emotional expression is too much for you without sounding terrible. Did you learn anything about yourself? She pressed. That's the harder question. I learned that I have limits I didn't know I had. I learned that I can be cruel when I feel trapped. I learned that my guilt about not being able to handle Marcus's emotions is complicated because part of me still believes I should have been able to handle them, that a better person wouldn't have reached a breaking point. But I also learned that I need space to feel my own feelings in a relationship, that I can't be someone's entire emotional support system, that I don't want to be with someone whose every emotion becomes my responsibility to manage. The worst part about what happened isn't that I said something cruel to Marcus. It's that I half meant it. Not the gendered part, not the real men construction, but the sentiment underneath. I did think he cried too much. I did think it was abnormal. I did think he needed to develop better coping mechanisms. And I still think those things, even though I know I'm not supposed to. Everyone thinks I'm the villain of this story, and by the facts available to them, I am. Woman tells crying man in crisis that real men don't cry, then gets upset when he ghosts her. That's the story. That's what happened. But it's also not the whole story. And I guess I'm telling you all of this now because I need someone to know the whole story, even if it doesn't change the basic fact that I said something indefensible. Even if knowing the context doesn't absolve me of anything. I don't regret the relationship ending. I regret how it ended. I regret my part in making sure that Marcus's story of failed love will always include a woman who mocked him for crying. I regret that those 4 words will probably follow both of us into future relationships. Him as proof that women can't handle vulnerable men, me as proof that I'm not as progressive as I think I am. But I don't regret reaching a breaking point. I don't regret knowing my limits. And I don't regret that I'm not in a relationship where I felt like I was drowning anymore. Sometimes I wonder if Marcus has gained any self-awareness about his patterns. If he's in therapy, actually working on emotional regulation. If his next girlfriend will face the same drowning feeling I did. If Sarah and I are just the first in a long line of women who will become villains for not being able to sustain the unsustainable. Or maybe we really are the villains. Maybe his next girlfriend will have infinite patience and compassion. Maybe she'll never reach a breaking point. Maybe the problem really was just that Sarah and I were broken in the same way, unable to handle what healthy emotional expression looks like. I don't know, I don't think I'll ever really know. What I do know is that I told him real men don't cry, he walked out mid-dinner, and he won't answer my calls. I know that everyone who hears that story thinks I'm terrible. I know that I can't defend myself without sounding defensive. And I know that even now, weeks later, I can't fully sort out how much I should feel guilty for versus how much I was justified in feeling. The truth is messy and complicated and doesn't fit into a neat narrative of victim and villain. But neat narratives are what stick. So I'm the woman who told a crying man to man up, and that's what I'll be in this story forever. I just needed someone to know there was more to it than that. Even if it doesn't change anything.